Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Executive Director IPP at Singularity University, Mr. Kian Gohar.
大家好. I can't believe I have to go on stage after this amazing performance. Can we give a round of applause to the DJ and the entertainment again, please? I am so happy to be back here in China. I first came to China 15 years ago when I was a business school professor in Shanghai. And it's so nice to come back to Beijing and see old friends and meet new ones again. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to talk to you about the future of technology and how you can use these trends to build strong, nimble, fast organizations. I work with two organizations in technology in California, one of which is the X Prize Foundation. We are the world's leader in creating large competitions to solve big problems, like putting together a $10 million prize to go to space 20 years ago. I also work with Singularity University in Silicon Valley, which is an organization that was founded to teach 1 billion people about how do you create new technologies and solve big problems. I've literally talked to hundreds of companies around the world, and I'm so happy to be here in Beijing to speak with you at Talking Data. So let's get started. Let's go back to the very beginning, very quick, short history lesson. If we look back at 10,000 years of human history, our entire mindset has always been very local and linear. What do I mean by that? It was local and linear because we were always looking for the next food where we were living. We were in a very confined environment. But over the last century, we've seen tremendous progress in society, whether it's a result of improvements in health or whether it's improvements in technology and cost. A whole century of progress and exploration. We're essentially gone from a world where we're living in the 18th century agrarian world to an industrial world to a post-industrial world, and now what I would call an exponential age. So you're going to hear this word exponential a lot in my talk, and I want to help you better understand what that means and what that feels like. So if we're looking at a linear world, and if you take 30 linear steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you essentially go 30 meters across the room. That's a linear thinking. But if you take 30 exponential steps, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, you essentially go 26 times around the size of the Earth, over 1 billion meters. This tremendous way of thinking. So why should you care about this right now? Well, in 10 years, many of the largest companies in the world won't exist because of this transformation, because of this disruption. The average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company across the world has gone from 67 years, 100 years ago, down now to less than 15 years. So why is this happening? Well, this is happening because information is going exponential. This is a slide I would like to point out for you guys to pay attention to. On the bottom here, you see this linear line, and now you see this exponential curve. The difference between this linear and this exponential curve is either a stress opportunity or a business opportunity. Technology is accelerating every rate of industry possible. And what we're seeing is this framework of every industry is going through these 6 steps, which my colleague Peter Diamandis, one of the founders of Singularity University, came up with. And I kind of want to go through these 6 just to give you a framework for thinking about exponential change. The first one is digitization. So my colleague at Singularity University, Ray Kurzweil, who is also the chief scientist at Google, looked at Gordon Moore's Moore's Law. And Gordon Moore was the founder of Intel in the 1950s, and he realized that the number of transistors on an integrated chip was doubling every 2 years. Ray Kurzweil, the co-founder of Singularity, looked at this over time, over history, and he saw that this rate of change was applying in every single time frame, and it kept being steady and consistent, no matter if there was an economic recession, whether there was war or whatever. So once this rate of exponential change starts, it doesn't stop. and it's very, very consistent. The second D is that it's deceptive. You won't see it coming. This is, again, our linear mindset versus our exponential growth in technologies. And when you're thinking about technologies at the very early stages, they're oftentimes disappointing. And it's where you go past the knee of the curve, where it says you are here, where then you ultimately create opportunities for amazement and new business models. Let me give you an example. Pop quiz. Here's a lily pond. If the lilies in this lily pond double every day, and it takes 30 days to cover the lily pond completely, on what day will it be half covered? Let me show you. Look to the top right of the graph. This is the lilies in the pond doubling every few days. You don't really notice the big change until days 25, 26, 27, 28, and by then, it's too late. This is why technology growing exponentially is deceptive. The third thing is that it's disruptive. We go from a world where the first company that created, for example, digital technology, digital photography technology, Kodak, had over $28 billion in sales. They created the technology. But fast forward, less than 20 years later, and they go bankrupt. And this little startup out of Silicon Valley with just 12 employees in the span of 18 months goes from zero to being $1 billion business. That's what we mean about it being disruptive. It's also dematerializing. Everything you have in this picture, which I love from the 1980s, all now fits into your smartphone. The smartphone that you have in your pocket is millions of times cheaper and smaller and 1,000 times more powerful than as the supercomputer was in the 1970s. And as things become dematerialized, they move towards zero marginal cost. And when things move to zero marginal cost, the domain explodes and everything becomes abundant and democratizes, which is the next and last D. This is just in a graph to show you how things democratize with cell phone service in Africa. We start with early in the 2000s, very little penetration, and as soon as cell phone service became cheap, the entire domain explodes. So what I want to walk you guys through for the next few minutes is to show you about how some of these technologies are themselves growing exponentially. And I'm going to go through each of these 7 layers, from computing to artificial intelligence to sensors, robotics, user interfaces, and crowds. And the thing to take away from this is that each of these technologies by themselves are powerful, but when you layer them on top of each other, these small S-curves become exponential leaps in innovation. So let's jump right into it. The most fundamental technology that's growing exponentially is computing, whether it's around chips and power, networks, cloud storage. Let me show you some data here. Over the last 20 years, we're seeing computing costs drop dramatically. This is just a slide to show you that the price of per million transistors is plummeting tremendously, a 500-time improvement from just the last 20 years. We're seeing bandwidth explode. Dollars per gigabytes of bandwidth is going dramatically down. And we're also seeing infinite storage. The price of storage has seen a 2,500% improvement in the last 20 years. Where is this all being stored? Well, it's increasingly being stored in the cloud. We see that by 2019, over 80% of all data center traffic is going to be stored on the cloud. We're seeing tremendous usage of cloud data. What's all this adding up to, this infinite bandwidth, this cheap computing, is that it's making it very inexpensive for startups to launch. This is a slide from the cost of an internet technology startup to begin. You can see how it's plummeted from $5 million 15 years ago to less than $5,000 now. You've seen technologies like artificial intelligence, Amazon Web Services, and cloud. Anybody can enter the game, and this is one of the most powerful things. So where is computing going? What are the blockbusters in computing technology in the future? One of them is around quantum computing. You may have heard about this. Let me just say a few words. A typical bit in IT is either a 0 or a 1, right? Well, a quantum bit, we call these qubits, is unique because it can be either 0 or a 1. And The value in this is that a quantum bit can do simultaneously 2 calculations for every transaction it does. So you can see very quickly where it goes from 1 qubit doing 2 calculations to 2 qubits doing 4 calculations, all of a sudden 30 qubits doing over 1 billion calculations. This becomes very, very powerful. And some problems are really well served by quantum computing. Let me give you some examples. So if you want to use quantum modeling to create new technologies, for example, new molecular transactions around chemistry, which is very difficult to do with the most advanced computers that we have right now, quantum computing can be very powerful. Or quantum encryption in terms of creating cybersecurity, or even looking at financial models in markets, looking at quantum finance. When is this going to happen? Probably in the next 4 to 5 years. We're almost at the point of being quantum ready. This is a chip that Google has built. There are 6 qubits on this chip right now. And they're testing this in the next few months. And they hope over the next year to ramp this up to anywhere between 30 and 50 qubits. So let me kind of put this in perspective for you. If we get to 30 or 50 qubits on a quantum chip, we will be able to harness all of the supercomputing power of the world in just one quantum chip. That's how powerful quantum computing can be. And right now, it's an academic exercise, and it needs to scale. But in the next 4 to 5 years, we're making very good progress towards this. Another frontier of computing is looking at the blockchain for sharing bandwidth. Now, can you imagine an economy where people are lending and borrowing unused bandwidth on their computers to be able to do transactions much closer to where devices are located rather than in the cloud? Imagine if this is like an Airbnb for lending unused data and unused computing power. This is happening, but it's the very early stages of it. Another really powerful tool for computing is looking at DNA storage. So DNA is a remarkable molecule. It is millions of times denser than any data storage device that we have, and it can store data for over 100 years without any corruption. This is really fascinating. Very recently, Microsoft and the University of Washington did an experiment where they stored over 200 megabytes of data on a DNA molecule. It included looking at this music video, 100 books, the UN Charter in 100 different languages, and all of this fit into the tip of a test tube, smaller than a pencil. So this is incredible potential. The downside with it is that it's very expensive to write and read. But I think in the next 10 years, this could be a very valuable storage device. The next area, which I think you guys are all really interested in, is looking at the world of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence means many different things. It can mean from cognitive computing to machine learning, intelligent agents, neural networks. It's a very big bucket catch-all phrase for essentially using AI to solve problems. Let me tell you about some problems that AI can try to solve. It can help us analyze big data and improve prediction accuracy. On this slide, we have a map of the country of Uganda in Africa. On the left-hand side, they're looking at poverty. So they did an in-person survey on the ground by going by village to village to village and looking where there's poverty. And the areas that are in red have a lot of poverty. So this was a very time-intensive, very expensive analysis. Instead, the map on the right is looking at the same problem using artificial intelligence. Essentially, by comparing millions of high-resolution satellite images from the nighttime versus the daytime, the system was able to identify where there is light and where there isn't light. And when there's no light, that's a higher prediction accuracy for mapping poverty. So the two are not exactly the same. The map on the right is much faster, and this is what AI can help us with, looking at big data in a very quick way. At the same time, AI is essentially learning to mimic the brain's neocortex and think in the same way that the brain is thinking through pattern recognition. AI has historically looked at very structured data, things that are predictable, but we're now using AI and pattern recognition to look at unstructured data. Let me give you an example of how we've used pattern recognition. I know you guys will all be familiar with this. So we can even teach algorithms to play the game of Go. which is a very complicated game, much more complicated than the game of chess, because there's exponentially more possibilities for Go. 2 years ago, Google had this computer called AlphaGo, the software, which was trained to combine deep learning and reinforcement learning to play Go against the grand champion Lee Sedol from Korea in 2016. Lee Sedol loses the game 4-1. And at the end of the game, he says, the difference between my abilities and the AI was that I, as a human, got tired, and the AI did not get tired. So think about that. It's very, very interesting. And AlphaGo learned how to play this game by watching 30 million games of humans play each other before they played AlphaGo. Now, AI experts knew that this was going to happen. But the thing that shocked everyone was that it happened 15 years sooner than even the experts expected it to happen. And that's what we mean when technology is deceptive. Now, fast forward to a year, and AlphaGo plays Kejie just a few months ago and beats the world champion 3-0. And Kejie says, AlphaGo is like a god of Go. So after beating Lee Sedol last year, AlphaGo literally watched millions and millions of games to improve its ability to solve really complex pattern recognition problems, and that's why it beat Kejie earlier this year. Now, the game of Go is a very powerful, useful platform for looking at problems around algorithms and very constrained environment. But the real world is a lot messier than a board game. So after this game, AlphaGo retired. It said, I'm done, I'm finished. And Google is now training AlphaGo to address big social problems, looking at problems like finding new cures in medicine, looking at how to reduce energy, how to develop new materials. This is a much more complicated issue in terms of trying to create advanced general learning purpose algorithms. The one thing that nobody is talking about, though, is that I just wanted to point out is, how much energy do you think it took for AlphaGo to beat Kejie? AlphaGo was connected to 2,000 central processors and almost 300 graphic processors. Those computers together generated 1 million watts of energy, 50,000 more times than the energy required for a human brain. So, as we're thinking about the very early stages of this evolving and solving social good problems, it is very beginning. It is very early. We have lots of issues to think about, including around the energy. So these deep neural networks have made huge progress in terms of looking at unstructured data and pattern recognition. And they're now looking at graphics, at sound, and they're also helping us in terms of looking at creativity. Let me give you some examples. This is a beautiful picture of the Great Wall of China. It's unfiltered. It's a perfect day in Beijing. I fed this to a neural network last week, and I said, I want you to draw a piece of art that looks a little bit more like Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. So I fed this to the neural network, and this is what I got. Pretty amazing. In less than 1 minute. Let's go back. This is what it looked like. And this is what it looks like now. I did another example, and I said, feed this to the neural network, and instead, I want you to draw this for me, like an architectural drawing. And in less than 1 minute, the neural network came back with this really interesting drawing. Now, this may seem fun, but we're at the early stages of using artificial intelligence to help us with creative processes as well. And so we've talked a lot about AI, but in order to use AI, you need data. And the best way to get data is through looking at physical sensors. So sensors are all sorts of things. They're small, they are simple, they're low battery, and they are very effective at the edges of a network without having much interaction or having much autonomous work. So let me give you some examples. I mean, right now, we've gone from 500 million connected devices a few years ago to 10 billion devices now. By 2020, we'll be at 50 billion connected devices, and very soon, we'll have a trillion sensor economy, of which, by 2030, 50% of all the data that's being used is going to be machine-to-machine communications. We're living in a world where everything is connected, whether it's your phone, whether it's your sporting equipment, whether it's your dog, your toothbrush, everything is connected. Here's an interesting visual. Look at how sensors has evolved just in the last 40 years. The picture on the left is the first digital camera that was created by Kodak 40 years ago, and now the most advanced smartphone camera. In terms of resolution, weight, and cost, it's 1 billion times improvement in 40 years. Now, what has that done? Well, that has changed how we look at the world of cameras. This is a chart of all the cameras in the world that were sold over the last 80 years. In gray is traditional film photography. In blue, you have digital cameras. And the yellow is looking at smartphone cameras. So the most recent data is 2016. It's pretty incredible. But let me tell you this. This chart is actually misleading because the real chart would be through the roof. That's how much data is being generated exponentially because of these new sensors. And as a result of this, we can put cheap, low-power sensors in almost anything. Your smartphone has over 25 sensors built into it right now. And the next generation of sensors is essentially creating connected devices out of things that you didn't think should be connected. For example, doorknobs, trash cans, doctors. All of these things are physical processes. These are manual processes. And as you put cheap, low-power sensors into them, they go from a world of being manual to automatic to then becoming invisible. This is what I want you to think about, this invisible point. Back in 1999, Mark Weiser, who was the chief technology officer of Xerox, said, the most profound technologies become invisible and they disappear into your day-to-day life. And this is where the world of sensors is going. So if you take all of this computation and miniaturize the sensors and put AI into things that move, then you have the world of robotics. And as AI starts moving around the world and interacts with its physical environment, what does that look like? How does it see? Well, it's seeing using very data-rich computer vision. Robots are helping us with productivity tasks in terms of at the workforce, in terms of factories. They're also helping us with more complicated tasks, for example, with surgery. This is a Da Vinci surgical robot that is used all the time now across the world for children's laparoscopy. And we're also seeing autonomous robots do surgery as well. This is from Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and is doing stitches. And it's right now 60% autonomous. I think very soon we're going to be living in a world where robots might also make us happy. So if I can get my slides back on the slide, please. I've lost the slides on the downstage monitor. I also think robots can help us be happy in the future, combining computer vision, accelerators, accelerometers, and also looking at computer vision. So this is a really interesting robot from Boston Dynamics. This is a convergence of all these technologies. We're living in a world where everything is going to be unmanned in the future. You're going to have robots in the air, like drones, with Amazon doing self-delivery of products anywhere in the world. We're going to have robots on the seas, which are going to help us track climate change and also weather patterns. And we're also going to have robots on the road. This is no longer just a car. It's not a combustion engine. It is essentially a supercomputer on wheels that's able to detect, using LiDAR technology, 750 megabytes of data per second and over 1 trillion data points. It's pretty incredible. And the implications for the future of these self-driving cars for us as a society is that we won't have to own much anymore. The distance between where you live and where you work is going to matter a lot less. So let me give you an example of what it feels like to be in a self-driving car. Let me just warn you, there's some interesting language in this video. Let's play.
Team will never believe this.
Oh my goodness. Go is the right word.
Holy shit. Holy shit. There's no fucking hands on that wheel. Oh my god. What? It's driving itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is the linear mind meeting this exponential world. And if you think it's really weird to go somewhere in a self-driving car, imagine if in the future you don't actually even have to go anywhere to experience things. Very soon, because of new user interfaces, we're going to be able to experience things in humanity like never before, whether that's entertainment, education, communication, and games. All of this we'll be able to do in digital worlds using new realities like augmented reality and virtual reality. So we currently live in this physical layer, but over the next few years, we're going to see data superimposed over our vision, whether it's through augmented reality or virtual reality, to help us actually live very, very digital worlds. So what does that mean? There's going to be an exponential development of data coming out of these new user interface layers. Here's a chart that shows a projection of augmented reality revenues over the next few years. By 2020, augmented reality is projected to have 1 billion users and over $100 billion in revenue. And over 80% of this is going to be from enterprise applications, like mobile network, e-commerce sales, advertising. And what's interesting to me is that all of this is largely being driven here in Asia. So as the world of augmented reality converges with Internet of Things, and companies start developing a connected infrastructure, we're going to have an exponential explosion of data connecting the workforce with their environment all around them, whether it's a hospital, a warehouse, or a factory. And augmented reality is going to create this new user interface to access this data. Now, we're also seeing it in the consumer space as well. Everybody knows this game. This is Pokemon Go from last year. In 6 months, it's generated over $2 billion in revenue. But what's interesting here is that this technology will become democratized very, very soon. And it's going to be developed in all of your consumer phones. Actually, Apple is going to release its new iPhone tomorrow, which is probably going to have augmented reality technology built into it. And once that happens, the domain will explode along the lines I explained to you guys earlier. The other thing I want you guys to be thinking about is that how do you think about tapping into the collective intelligence of the world all around you to do things faster, cheaper, creatively? There are right now 4 billion people who are not connected online. And every major technology company, from Facebook to Google to Apple to SpaceX and Virgin, they're trying to create technologies to connect the world with low bandwidth internet connectivity. So what happens when you have 4 billion new minds coming on the world and consuming data? The thing to take away here is that no matter who you are, the smartest people always work for somebody else. They don't always work for companies like yours. So tap into this collective intelligence of 4 billion new people around the world. Imagine if you live in a world where you can find anyone to do anything at any time, and then you scale it up. They don't have to be in Beijing. They don't have to work for your company. They can be in Tanzania. They could be in Chengdu. So I've kind of shown you how these technology layers are individually adding up and creating this new exponential leaps in innovation. And then if you apply these convergence layers to every major industry, you start seeing new business models arrive. And these business models are all driven around data. Let me just kind of take you through 2 industries that are radically changing because of these new exponential technologies. One is around the future of making things. So everybody's heard about 3D printing. 3D printing is pretty basic. It's been around for 30 years. It's essentially adding layer upon layer upon layer of material on a project. But what's happening is that these new convergence of technologies, for example, new materials, new designs, new manufacturings, they are democratizing a $10 trillion industry. And we're going from a world where a few people are designing for millions to millions of people designing for millions of people. And all of this creation, production, and distribution is localized, and there's very, very little wastage. We're seeing 3D printing capabilities for many different kinds of products, whether it's plastics and body parts, metal, fabric. And what I love about this new technology is that it's also growing incredibly fast. The technology's been around for 30 years, but just in the last 2 years, this new company called Carbon 3D has developed a new technology that is 100 times faster than normal 3D printing. And they do this by creating a photochemical process showing ultraviolet light to alter the resin as it interacts with oxygen in the air. So imagine going from a world which is very slow, it's been around a long time, and all of a sudden now, this happens incredibly, incredibly fast. Now, this video has been sped up 7 times for you guys to see it, but it is still remarkable in terms of how 3D printing technology is changing. Now, Adidas has decided very recently to use this technology in its new shoe called the Kraft 4000. The entire sole of this shoe is now going to be 3D printed in one piece, which eliminates every weak spot in the material. And Adidas is essentially going to use this design for the design of the product and also for the manufacturing. So they're going to skip the whole tooling process. Now, typically, to make the sole, it takes 10 hours. Using this technology, it's going down to 90 minutes. By next year, they're going to be able to print this within 20 minutes. So they're going to be able to ramp up the scale of this manufacturing. This year, they're going to have 5,000 shoes. Next year, they're going to have 100,000 shoes. Who wants one of these shoes? Yeah? I want one of these shoes. This is incredible. The implications for data here is that in the future, anytime we use 3D printing technology, the birthday of that material is going to be embedded into the product. The data is going to be embedded into the product. So in the future, let's say you have a product recall, and you need to know which batch the product came from. You don't have to pull everything back out from the consumer market. You can just go to the embedded data within the material that's printed and say, it came from this particular batch. That's really fascinating. Now, if you use 3D printing for very large materials, you can even manufacture cars or houses. This is the world's first 3D printed car made by Local Motors. The design was outsourced by a community of car enthusiasts. It took 12 hours to make it, to print it, and it cost $15,000. And I can tell you, it was really fun to drive, really, really fun to drive. Now, if you take this technology of 3D printing and you layer on top of that artificial intelligence, you're able to create these new materials and these new manufacturing models that would be previously impossible using traditional methodologies. And this is what we call generative design. Let me show you. This is an engine block made of metal that was designed using artificial intelligence. It's incredibly, incredibly strong and very, very lightweight and looks kind of weird. But this essentially is an engine. The prototype was built with sensors all around it, and as it was going through the development process, the sensors embedded into the material was giving performance data back to the design process, and the design was changing at the same time while it was making it. So essentially, this engine block was co-designing itself. And this is incredible in terms of what we can do. Now, the second area I want to say a few words about was around the future of medicine and biology. If you take this convergence of sensors and AI, you can essentially become the CEO of your own health. Very recently at the X Prize, we had a $10 million competition to create a sensor that could diagnose 10 major disease states. And we awarded that this year to 2 teams from the United States and also from Taiwan. We're very quickly moving in medicine from a world that is reactive. You get sick, we react, we try to figure out a cure for you, to a world where it's proactive health, where we're going to use data and sensors to keep you healthy before you even get sick. But if you do get sick and you need drugs, well, artificial intelligence can help us design those new drugs as well. A typical drug discovery process can take anywhere from 12 to 15 years. A company in San Francisco called Atomwise is streamlining the initial stages of this drug discovery. And instead of taking months and months to look at individual molecules, it's able to look at 1 million molecules per day using artificial intelligence. We're essentially creating a new programming language. Instead of zeros and ones, we are using nucleotides, G, A, T, C, that make up the DNA to create a new language. One of the most phenomenal discoveries of recent times is this protein called CRISPR-Cas9, which is essentially able to edit the human genome very, very quickly and very easily using this protein molecule. And in fact, a Chinese team very recently edited a human embryo that had genetic disorders and was able to take out this deficiency from the embryo, which is tremendous in terms of how it can help us for humanity in the future. So I've sort of shown you how each of these industries will be changed by the convergence of these new technologies, and they're all going to involve sensing, analyzing, and manipulating data at the heart of each function. So let me share with you some key takeaways. Number one, the only constant is change. As I've shown you from the very beginning of this talk, the rate of change is increasing. If you don't keep up with this rate of change, you will never catch up. And this is one of the most important things why you constantly have to learn and constantly have to be at the edge of your organization to keep up with this change. This is one of the most important things, and one of the reasons why many large organizations are not being successful these days, because they can't keep up with this rate of change. Number two is that you're seeing competition from many unusual places. So it's no longer, for example, a large company that is competing with its other large company. These convergence layers are letting startups have access to the same tools that large organizations have. These same technologies like cheap computing, artificial intelligence, cloud, it's accessible to anybody. So all of a sudden, your competition isn't who you thought it was. It could be a startup all the way across the other side of the world that is not even in your industry. This is something to think about. Number three, follow the data to find the money. Many people say data is like the new oil or the new gold. Well, that's the wrong way to think about it, because oil and gold are fixed. Data is like solar energy. It's abundant. It's exponentially available. And the most important thing that you can think about is how do you become a trusted data partner for your clients? Increasingly, individuals, companies, organizations, and governments are much more picky about which data they share with their ecosystem. So how do you make sure that consumers see value in the data that they share with you to create opportunities for themselves? So become a trusted data partner. Number four, create a data network effect. So data becomes much more valuable as it integrates with other data and creates a self-reinforcing loop to create new kinds of data that on its own wasn't available. So how do you think about using machine learning to improve everything you do? How do you think about bringing more people to use the data and to enrich the data even further? Because that's really the area that's going to be very valuable. And number five, don't depend on innovation solely from the inside of your company. I mentioned to you that there's billions of people who are now connected online, and they're able to access the same kind of resources that you can. So if you're thinking about innovation solely from the inside of your organization, you're likely to lose. Now, I know you guys have all taken the first step towards this takeaway by coming here to T11. And as many of you know, Talking Data has created this ecosystem to really help its clients build upon and leverage the exponential growth opportunities here in China. And that is almost entirely because of the leadership and vision of Talking Data's CEO, Leo Tsui, who has worked incredibly hard not only to create an ecosystem, but also a community who is really passionate about creating change, not only for their companies, but also for society as a whole. It's my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you today Talking Data CEO, Leo Tsui.